Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon. Long time no see, as usual. As I said, if you're only subscribed to this channel and you want to see more content, because I know I don't post on here as often, then go over to 13 o'clock podcast. I have like a bunch more stuff over there: book reviews, movie reviews, live streams, all kind of fun stuff. So if you think that I don't post enough on this channel. So here we are, finally getting back to this long running series after I don't even remember when the last one was. So if you're keeping track, that means that we have arrived at the exalted year of 1984. Now, this was the year that I turned 12 years old. Now, a lot of really good horror movies came out in 1984, but I will say that my top five were pretty easy to pick for this one. As usual, I also have a handful of honorable mentions, which are in no particular order. Children of the Corn. It's an adaptation of the 1977 Stephen King short story of the same name, which was in his Night Shift collection. The movie takes a lot of liberties with the source material, and it's, not gonna lie, kind of cheesy in places, but I kind of can't help loving it anyway. I saw it on cable like a bunch of times when I was growing up, and I just, have a soft spot for it. I think like Linda Hamilton is in this, and Peter Horton playing the couple at the center of it, and they play well off each other, I think. So, obviously most people probably know the story, but it's this couple. They're going on a drive. I think they're going to California. And they get lost in this little nowhere burg in the Midwest, Gatlin, Nebraska, where the kids in the town have all gotten this weird folk religion and killed off all the adults. Now, the real stars of the show, I'm going to say, are the two main villains, who are Isaac, played by a very, very creepy actor by the name of John Franklin, and the red-haired Malachi, played by Courtney Gaines, who was also in another one of my very favorite 80s horror comedies, The Burbs, which was directed by Joe Dante, actually, who we'll be talking about a little bit later on. So another great cheesy classic that, in this day and age has like a huge cult following is Chud, which was directed by Douglas Cheek. And it's about a homeless shelter manager and a cop who kind of team up to try to figure out what's been happening to New York City's homeless people who have been disappearing at quite an alarming rate. So they soon find out, spoiler alert, that there are these kind of mutated humans. The Chud of the title, Cannibalistic Humanoid Underground Dwellers, is what that stands for. They're down in the sewers, and they've been, munching on the homeless people. This is one of the best B movies of the 1980s, and is still like a hell of a lot of fun. It has some serious themes to it, but it's still like a lot of fun to watch. So this one, not strictly a horror movie as much as kind of a science fiction and maybe horror tinged adventure movie, and that would be Dreamscape, directed by Joseph Rubin. It has Dennis Quaid in it, and he's playing like a psychic who, up to this point in the movie, has been using his psychic gifts for, I guess, not nefarious purposes, but just kind of shitty, shallow purposes, I guess, just like gambling and skirt chasing and whatnot. But he ends up getting in some hot water with a gangster, like owes him a bunch of money. So to sort of hide out, he agrees to participate in this experiment, which essentially entails him linking minds with other test subjects and like going into their dreams. So it's this great premise, has some pretty creepy imagery in it, and blends genre like really well. I watched it again pretty recently, and the special effects in some places are pretty dated, but overall I think like it really holds up. Probably my second favorite Friday the 13th film after part two is Friday the 13th, the final chapter, which was the fourth one. Of course, it wasn't the final chapter, as we all know. Now, this one is actually significant for introducing the recurring character of Tommy Jarvis, who in this one is played as a kid by Corey Feldman, and also highlighting the wonderful madness that is Crispin Glover and that dance that he does in this movie. If you've seen this movie, you know what I'm talking about, because that shit is just unforgettable. I mean, Crispin Glover, he's just one of a kind. You know what I mean? There's just no words that can describe it. This one is also really good because of Tom Savini's excellent effects work. And I think my favorite my favorite gag is just like at the end where Jason's face like goes sliding down the machete. I think that's like such a great effect, and probably one of my favorite effects like in the entire series. So one of the best Christmas slashers. Also one of the most controversial films of the decade, even though it's probably hard to see why like nowadays. But now I'm talking about Silent Night, Deadly Night. So this movie, which came out in '84, focused on what was then a fairly rare trope, the killer Santa. So our villain in this, whose name is Billy Chapman, he sees his parents murdered by a killer Santa when he's a kid, and then he subsequently gets sent to an orphanage where he's horribly abused. So when he grows into an adult, he becomes obsessed with people being naughty, and he dresses as Santa to punish like people he sees as transgressors or whatever. Now, obviously, killer Santa movies are like a dime a dozen nowadays, but this one kind of really blew the doors open. In 1984, when this came out, it was so reviled. Everyone was like, you can't have a horror movie with a killer Santa. Like, what kind of blasphemy? Like, it was a big fucking deal, which is like funny to think about now. But it was the backlash was so bad that they had to pull the movie out of the theater like after 1 week, like because everybody freaked out about it so much, which is pretty hilarious, like considering the all of the killer Santa movies that have come out since then. It's pretty tame by today's standards, but it's still a holiday horror classic. And honestly, that just iconic shot of the half naked Linnea Quigley, like impaled on the deer antlers, I mean, that's just like a scene for the ages. Now, this one, it's a bit of an idiosyncratic choice, I admit, because technically it's a documentary. Well, not technically, it is a documentary. But I decided to include it anyway, just because I saw it so many times on cable back in the day, and I just really liked the whole vibe of it so much. It's called Terror in the Isles. It was directed by Andrew Kuhn. I guess is how you pronounce his last name. I'm not entirely sure. This is actually one of the best, if not the best, horror documentaries of the era. And it's hosted by Donald Pleasance and Nancy Allen, which is great. And does like a really good job kind of breaking down different types of horror films, showing a whole bunch of clips of relevant films, like going all the way back to, the early days of horror movies, and has a lot of like insightful commentary. So if you love documentaries about the genre and you haven't seen this one from 1984, then I would definitely recommend it. All right, so those are all the honorable mentions out of the way. So let's get on to the main attraction. So this movie, directed by Neil Jordan, not really sure. It's kind of like a stylish gothic fairy tale, probably closer to fantasy than horror, though it does get pretty gory in places and has like some really well done like werewolf transformations. Now this was actually based on a 1979 short story by Angela Carter, which was in a collection called The Bloody Chamber. And the story itself was actually a loose retelling of Little Red Riding Hood. So the Company of Wolves is set up almost like an anthology, like with the main narrative containing several kind of nested stories within stories that are all kind of similarly themed around like a fairy tale werewolf kind of thing. So we start out the movie in the present day of 1984. And there's a girl named Rosaline, and she's dreaming that she lives out in the countryside in the 18th century. Now, in the dream, her sister Alice gets eaten by wolves, and Rosaline goes to live with her grandma, who's actually played by Angela Lansbury, as all good grandmas should be. Now, while the main Red Riding Hood narrative is going on, like playing out with, Rosaline, her grandma, and then there's this other boy that Rosaline is like, has the hots for or whatever. There's like a whole thing going on with that. Grandma is also telling Rosaline a couple of stories, and Rosaline also tells a couple of stories. She tells one to her mom, and then she tells one to the huntsman, who is also a werewolf. So, like I said, it's all these nested stories. It sounds convoluted, but it doesn't come across as confusing on screen at all. Like, I didn't find it confusing. The structure of it is unorthodox, sure, but I didn't find it particularly difficult to follow. So the vibe of this movie, it's kind of like Labyrinth, but a lot darker and much bloodier. And I mean, it has like a similar girl coming of age and learning to avoid predators kind of theme, and also kind of has a similar like slightly surrealist or like more fantasy based like aesthetic to it. I mean, the scene where all the nobles at the long dining table like all turn into werewolves. I mean, technically, I guess they're German shepherds, but whatever. Like, it still like looks pretty cool. I mean, that's a classic scene, like with all the pink like in the background. It's like really cool looking. But I mean, the whole movie is like a real treat if you're really into werewolves and Grimm's fairy tales and that kind of stuff. So I will say that even though this is actually not among my favorite Stephen King adaptations. It's not even among my favorite King adaptations just from the 80s, but it's still like a really solid movie that I find myself kind of enjoying more and more like each time I rewatch it. I guess like I find new stuff in it. Most people are probably familiar with the story of Firestarter, but if not, it's about a little girl named Charlie, who's played by Drew Barrymore, who has pyrokinesis, as in she can start fires with her mind, and her dad, Andy, who can do like psychic mind control. Like he can persuade people to do things just by thinking really hard at them, like even though he gets a nosebleed after. So they're being pursued by these kind of shady representatives of this thing called the Shop, which is this government agency, like a secret government agency that did human experimentation, like with drugs and shit, like back in the day. That was the thing that gave Andy and his wife, who's Charlie's mom, like their telekinetic or psychic powers in the first place. So it's kind of like an MK Ultra kind of thing going on. Now, the movie is actually pretty faithful to the book, like in the way it's constructed. And I think that's largely to its benefit. It does sag a little bit in the middle after Charlie and Andy get captured by the Shop and are like, imprisoned in there. But it's still an entertaining watch. It's a little bit slow in places and could have been a little bit shorter, but that's okay. It's not too big of a deal. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out the excellent and very, very unsettling performance of George C. Scott as John Rainbird. It's a little bit annoying that they got a white actor to, play a Native American character. The character is Native American in the book. But, it's not a huge deal, I guess. And I mean, George C. Scott is like terrifying in this. And I think like the thing that's really scary about his character in the context of the movie is that the audience knows that he's malevolent and knows that he's manipulative and evil, but the little girl, Charlie, doesn't know that and very happily befriends him. Like she thinks he's an awesome guy. And so the suspense comes from like us knowing something that she doesn't know and like watching this whole thing happen like, oh no, you know what I mean? So I think that the interactions between the two of them are like a highlight of the movie for me. Gotta say too, another big plus in this is like all the pyrotechnic work. They didn't have CG back in 1984, not really, except for like little wireframe animation and shit. I mean, the firework in this is like astounding, like even today, I think. And the last scene where Charlie just finally lets loose and like uses her powers and throwing fireballs everywhere and just like burning the whole fucking place to the ground is just completely epic. And also, I will say too that I think it's great that the character of Charlie still retains the audience's sympathy and goodwill, despite essentially being a mass murderer many times over. And I will say that I guess that is a credit to just how goddamn adorable Drew Barrymore is in this when she was little. So how could I talk about 1984 without talking about this? Joe Dante's awesome, awesome Christmas horror comedy. Easily one of the best films in the 1980s. And I just love the way it takes this kind of heartwarming, sweet, like Spielbergian story about this adorable, magical pet and kind of crossbreeds it with this very gory, violent cavalcade of monster carnage. And it totally, totally works. Like this could have gone so wrong, but it just went so right. It's just completely refreshing and the whole thing is just like a hell of a lot of fun, like the whole way through. Now I will say, and I think that most horror fans probably know this, but the severe like tonal switch, I guess, if you want to call it that, although it feels very organic to me, like it doesn't feel like, oh my God, this just went fucking tonal whiplash, you know what I mean? Like into a horror movie when it was kind of this sweet Spielbergian thing about like a cute little creature. But the thing about this movie is that this was one of the movies that spurred the creation of PG-13. Yeah, we didn't have PG-13 before 1984. Obviously that's the rating between PG and R. The other movie that actually contributed to this, that was also a supposed family film that came out the same year and went in a similarly grotesque direction, surprisingly, was of course Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And I still remember, because I was 12 years old in 1984, so I was pretty cognizant of what was going on. I still remember some parents like being absolutely apoplectic after taking their kids to see either Gremlins or Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, thinking it was just going to be family fun or whatever, and then having to deal with their children, screaming their heads off, basically at the sight of Gremlins being blown up in microwaves or put in the blender and chopped up, and, having living people like have their hearts pulled right out of their chests and shit like that. I mean, the 80s didn't fuck around. So again, I feel like Gremlins probably doesn't need much introduction. I think most people have probably seen it. But, for younger, watchers who maybe have not seen it, it's about a teenage boy named Billy, played by the seemingly ageless Zach Galligan. I think I've called him that before because he seems like he looks the same, like no matter when you see him. So he gets this kind of fuzzy, adorable, like big-eared creature called a Mogwai as a Christmas present from his dad. His dad actually bought it at, this your standard issue like mysterious shop in Chinatown or whatever. So Billy names this little guy Gizmo. Gizmo is actually voiced by Howie Mandel. He doesn't really talk. He kind of talks, but it's just kind of like baby word, like a baby voice. Everything seems hunky dory at first, until several things conspire to break all three rules of caring for a Mogwai. Those rules being: don't expose him to light, don't get him wet, and don't feed him after midnight. Now, shockingly, breaking those rules results in some pretty gruesome shit happening, honestly. Gizmo, starts sprouting little pods, out of his back that kind of pop off, and then they eventually kind of hatch into these little, ugly, reptilian monsters who are basically little murderous mayhem machines. You know what I mean? And they can also reproduce at an astounding rate. Like, if they get wet, they start reproducing. So soon enough, this whole town is overrun with these things, and, the body count begins to stack up pretty alarmingly. So yeah, I mean, Gremlins, it's a holiday classic. It's a black comedy for sure, but it definitely has some gore and some horror elements to it. A lot of people die in pretty horrible ways and shit like that. The effects work in this is excellent. All the puppetry and stuff like that still looks awesome. And the whole thing just has this really over the top, chaotic tone that just makes the whole thing just so fun to watch, just from beginning to end. And again, I would be remiss if I didn't point out the wonderful, wonderful Phoebe Cates in this, and her infamous, very grim story about her dad dressing up as Santa on Christmas Eve and coming down the chimney and getting stuck there and dying. And it's just kind of this kind of fun movie, and then the whole thing stops and she tells this horrifying fucking story. And I remember being really kind of traumatized by that. But yeah, I mean, like I said, it's really a tribute to, the writing and Joe Dante's directing and stuff like that. That's something this, that's coming from two different directions, essentially works so well as an organic whole. And I mean, this is still a Christmas classic for a reason, and I watch it pretty much every year around the holidays. So I will say I'm not usually the biggest fan of post-apocalyptic horror. I do like some of it, but it's not usually my favorite subgenre. However, Night of the Comet is really kind of something special. It's just so winning and so lovable, and I just find it really, really hard to resist it, you know what I mean? Just because I just love the vibe of it so much. So this was actually written and directed by Tom Eberhardt, who also did Honey, I Blew Up the Kid, and was kind of pitched as something like Valley Girl meets Repo Man. Both of those movies are also excellent, by the way. So this is kind of again, less a horror movie. It does have horror elements in it, but it's more like a black comedy. So it's kind of this kind of dark adventure movie about the end of the world, but seen through the eyes of two teenage girls. So you have 18-year-old Reggie and her 16-year-old sister Sam, and they have your typical kind of 80s teenage girl problems, like not getting along with their new stepmom and having some mysterious person beating your high score on Tempest down at the arcade. We've all been there, you know what I mean. Now, it so happens that there's a comet that's going to be passing close to the Earth a few days before Christmas. I think it's a week or two before Christmas, something like that. But the girls aren't really that concerned about it, and everybody else seems to think, ooh, it's just going to be a neat thing to see, and they're having comet parties and all this other kind of crap. So both the sisters kind of have their own personal things going on. Reggie is kind of getting busy with her boyfriend in the projection booth of the movie theater where she works. And Sam ends up spending the night in a steel shed after having a fight with their stepmother. So they don't really initially think too much of it when they wake up the next morning and find that the sky is red, with this weird haze. They just think it's pollution, right? They're not really worried about it. But there's also this bunch of strange piles of red dust everywhere that have mysterious piles of clothing next to them. So eventually the girls figure out that obviously the comet has wiped out most of the people on Earth and turned some of the remaining people into zombies. Now, obviously pretty shocked and upset by this, as you would be, they regain their aplomb pretty quickly, I have to say. And so they start to kind of navigate this new world they find themselves in. They go to the mall, arm themselves with weapons, get some bitchin' new duds. And they also start trying to track down this man they heard over the radio who's like looking for survivors. So they try to battle their way to the radio station to find him, and look for other survivors. You know what I mean? So yeah, I can't really remember seeing another apocalyptic movie like this charming. There are some other ones, but I really, really like this one. I just really like the vibe of it. And the two leads are just these kick-ass chicks, and they're kind of portrayed as like Valley Girl type things, like kind of vapid, like at the beginning a little bit. But then as the movie goes on, you start to realize that was just like surface level. Like really, they're super intelligent and super resourceful. And the fact that they just like get their shit together and just like, yeah, we're going to figure all this out. It's just like really, really awesome. So this is a beloved cult classic for a reason. And if you're a fan of 80s horror, and especially if you're a fan of apocalyptic 80s horror, then you definitely need to see this if you haven't. Now, here's another one that I feel like is just obvious. Like, duh, this is going to be on the list for 1984. This is one of the best horror movies of all time. So, directed by Wes Craven, obviously, and it's just an excellent supernatural slasher. And not only introduced the world to one of the most iconic villains in horror, but also kickstarted this hugely long-running movie franchise and a multimedia merchandising juggernaut, really. I mean, there was just so much peripheral merch that went along with these movies. But I'm going to say, for all the movies, TV shows, Halloween costumes, coffee mugs, Crocs, branded vibrators, probably, I don't know. I'm going to say, the OG Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984 is still the best one and the scariest one of them all, in my humble opinion. So this movie was actually based on kind of loosely based, on a series of articles that Wes Craven read. I think it was in the LA Times. It's a true story about Hmong refugees, and they had been having these horrifying nightmares, and some of them would later died in their sleep, and they couldn't figure out what was killing them. You know what I mean? So he kind of got the idea of your nightmares killing you, kind of thing. So the movie is centered around this group of teenagers who slowly begin to realize that they're all dreaming of the same terrifying looking person who's this badly burned man with knives for fingers. They find out later they're gloves, but you know what I mean. So as the characters all get picked off one by one in just gloriously bloody and creative ways, famously in an early role, Johnny Depp gets sucked into a bed, and then there's a subsequent blood fountain, which is pretty fucking great, while he's watching Miss Nude America. You know what I mean? So it starts to become clear that if you're killed by this man in your dream, you die in real life. So they later find out that the man, obviously, Freddy Krueger, was once a child murderer in the town. I think he was initially supposed to be a molester, but they, kind of toned down on that a little bit. So what happened was, back then, the parents of all the murdered teens, in the present day, had partaken in some vigilante justice back then after he got acquitted of his crimes because of some technicality or something. So they ended up locking him in the famous boiler room and burning him alive. So Freddy thus became sort of like a dream demon, kind of punishing the people who killed him by taking revenge on their children. I mean, A Nightmare on Elm Street, it was just such a brilliant idea, using the tropes of the slasher movie, but then introducing a really pronounced supernatural dream element that allowed all the kills to be really distinct and just wildly imaginative. I thought that was such a great idea. And I mean, Robert Englund, this was his first time playing Freddy. I mean, he's terrifying here because I kind of feel in the later movies, they turned him into this wisecracking comedian, and I think that defanged the character somewhat. But in this one, he's actually really, really scary, and so I think that's why this one is a lot more effective. He does say some kind of funny shit in this one, but not the way, like I said, he got vaudevillian in the later ones, which I didn't like as much. And I also have to point out the awesomeness of one of the best final girls in horror history, Nancy Thompson, obviously played by Heather Langenkamp, and she just kind of musters every bit of grit and ingenuity to fight back against Freddy with everything she's got, and ends up succeeding, well, kind of, until the sequel anyway. So, I mean, everything about this movie rules, and honestly, I consider the first Nightmare on Elm Street kind of required viewing. If you're a horror fan at all, you definitely need to see at least the first one. The other ones are not as crucial, I guess. Although the third one's great too. But I mean, the first one is a fucking classic, and you need to watch it if you haven't. Okay, so I finally got through 1984. So stay tuned for whenever it is that I get around to doing 1985. Like I said, it'll probably be a while, but I try to do these like quicker. But you know what I mean. I have so much stuff going on the other channel too that sometimes I don't get to these as quick because these take a little bit longer. But yeah, I'll do 1985 next. So I've already got an idea of probably what the top 5 are going to be, but I won't spoil it for you. So yeah, as always, thank you very much for watching and spending some time with me in the salon. Please remember, like, share, subscribe, comment, and all of that good stuff. And I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.